Well, I'm a PHP developer and I build business applications for the web. And since DataFlex has come out with a new web framework, I see some benefits in that framework that made me think of switching to DataFlex. And I'm talking about the major benefits I see in using DataFlex to create business applications, both in the speed of development and the maintainability of the applications in the end.
Hi, my name is Johan Broddfelt and I'm from Front IT in Denmark, which is a partner to Data Access. And I'm going to talk about a comparison between some different development platforms and the DataFlex platform, and kind of focusing on some things that I think is important and makes the DataFlex way of doing things very nice. So I'm going to tell you about my background, my view on DataFlex historically, what experience I have with DataFlex, and then I'm going to define what I mean by a framework and show you how you build applications in different kind of frameworks, and in order to compare with DataFlex. And then I'm going to try to give you a sense of what I feel is more suitable for business applications. And if you don't get it by then I'm going to do some extra slides to really try to show you what I'm talking about. So let's get started. I actually don't have a lot of background in DataFlex. I've been working with some Microsoft products, some C++ and in Perl quite a lot of time. And in 2006 I switched to PHP and developed web applications in PHP. And in 2007 I started working for Sture on a big DataFlex application, but that was console mode. But I got inspired because I saw some things in the DataFlex console mode application. So I wrote my own PHP framework in order to speed up the process and built a new web application with that framework. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that as well. And then I started at Front IT, and I was supposed to write DataFlex code, of course, because they are a reseller of DataFlex. But yeah, I did Windows applications and thought they were really great. But the web framework wasn't too good, and I'm a web kind of guy, so I've stuck with PHP for a long time until now. You see the last orange dot down there. I actually started using DataFlex again to build application, and so you have the DataFlex Studio for Windows, a really great tool for building Windows applications, and I wouldn't choose anything else if I'm going to build a Windows application. But with the old web framework, after you've done the wizards and got the views, then you were kind of left out in the cold. Because you need to write JavaScript and ASP and everything to just get it to work. So that's why I dropped that. Another reason why I haven't been using DataFlex as much is because the syntax is kind of different. You have the conventional syntax where you assign a variable with an equal sign, for example. And in DataFlex you have the move and the equation to myvar and get and set object of. In my world, the left one is more intuitive, but of course, if you are a DataFlex developer, that one on the left side might be a bit confusing. My definition of a framework is that you have some part of the code where you store your logic that manages everything for you, and then you have the presentation layer, which is generating the interface, the buttons, the click events, and everything that the user is working with. And then you have the database, which is basically the same regardless of which development platform you use. So it's just there to show that the database is kind of below everything. In the logic, you have the model. And in DataFlex, we have data dictionaries. Basically, what the model does, it contain validation, and it's have some structure of the data to handle, and it might have specific events. If one table should update another table, then it should be in the model. Then you have the view, which is the presentation, normally done in HTML and JavaScript, CSS. And you have the controller, which handles all the events, like when you click a button, then you have an event, or if you want to show a specific page, then you tell the controller to display the new page instead. But I also want to add tools, which is if a framework has a lot of features like string handler, math, and database connectivity to different databases, and some features. You have user login, you have unit test, you have log features and stuff like that. And the way I've structured it is, if they're a white background, then you have to write basically all the code yourself. If there's orange background, then they have some features, or they have some instructions on how to do this, some specifications that you need to follow. And if they're green, basically you get them included in the framework. PHP frameworks, there are a lot of those, and they all compete in some major areas. For example, how beautiful code they can write and how fast they can execute, and that's gone so far. So some of the top PHP frameworks, you actually have to install an application before you can start writing your code, because when you compile your code, it turns into some C code, because that's faster. Especially CodeIgniter, I've seen does that, converts to PHP to speed it up. Basically, they don't care what your application look like. They just want to give you the basic features, the tools and the features to make your site work really fast and really good. And then you have to build your site on top of that. And they have some instructions on this is how you build a model, this is how you build your controller, and this is how you build your front end. So this is basically a model from CakePHP, where you have some validations. And if you go on to the controller, you have, there's a sample of a function view, and you have a function add when you click the add button down below. So this is the controller file or class. And then you have the view. And here you can see it's basically HTML with some inserted PHP code. And you have some, I think, cryptic line of code that generates a button for you. I actually prefer to write the button as well in HTML and then use that, but they're probably using some JavaScript to generate the event, so that's why they do it this way. My framework, I want to go from the idea to the application as fast as possible, and don't look at how the model should do and the controller and the view. I just want to create my database and then let the application generate everything for me. So what I did is I have a class, it's the model on top. So I basically tell the application which table this class should use. And the controller is composed of the URL that shows which view to be used. So I can just create a regular link to that URL, and then that view will be displayed. And some parts of the controller is in the view, as I will show you later. And then you have the view code. And the reason why this is split up into 2 lines is because edit mod is actually putting out PHP code, and the edit is generating a view that I can use. So I can create these standard files and run the application, and I will get views that looks like this without doing any coding at all. And if I want to add like a header detail or remove an ID or change something in the interfaces, then I have to add the mod parameter to the URL, and then I get the code that I can copy and paste into the view file instead. And then I can modify that. And as you see, I have the controller save event up here, and I have the save button down there. So that's basically the same way as the other PHP work. ExtJS is a JavaScript framework for building applications, and they actually are focusing on creating a really nice user interface. So you have the JavaScript and you have the dynamic views and everything, which is really cool. And they also have some of the basic features handling data for you. But you're basically on your own writing the data manager and the database related tables, the model. And when they work with this framework, they usually use the local storage to handle data. And if you want a database in the bottom, so everyone can access the data from different browsers, then you still need some kind of framework in the bottom to manage that. So you will have 2 frameworks. And since the entire framework is in JavaScript, then you can always go in and look at the code in the browser, and you can figure out how the application is made, and you could possibly figure out how to hack the application as well if it's poorly written. So I'm not that huge a fan of this framework. And here you have the model, and you have almost an identical file which is called the store, which handles the manipulation of data. And then you have the controller, and here's an example of an event on clear message button, which is handling when you click that button. And you have some other buttons as well, and view presentation. And in the view layer, you have a view constructor that reads a 5th file that has a JSON object that will generate some view elements, or will define some view elements that will be generated automatically. And in that JSON object, you can see the ID clear message button. So when you click that one, you will get the event triggered. And this is kind of the look and feel. It's not the one I showed you, but it's the look and feel of ExtJS. So what else do we have? We have Microsoft, Visual Studio, and that's like a giant in the development market. And you can build anything you set your mind to. And that also means that they have some wizards, they have some tools that will generate some code for you and help you along, but you can do so many things and in so many different ways, so it's easy to get lost if you don't have a standard way of doing things. And if you look at the model, here are some definitions of the table columns and some validation formats. You have the controller, and here you have a create event that you are binding to the movie button. It's outside of the scope there. And if you go into the view, then you can see the create button down there in the code. And also here you see it's an HTML file with some ASP or C# code included into the file. And I think it's obfuscating the HTML, so it's not as easy to work with because they are generating some of the layout elements behind the scenes. And then we have the Microsoft LightSwitch, because you wanted to make it really easy to build applications. And since 2013, Microsoft released this for free, so you can download and try it out. And it's basically a configuration panel where you can add a button, add a field, add whatever you like, and it's really intuitive to work with. But if you're going to create a new view, you can't copy a part of this view and put it into the other view. And it's not easy to search for where did I put that code. You need to scroll down. And if the application is getting larger, then I can imagine it's getting harder and harder to maintain because you have to look through all of these lists. But here you have the edit button. And again, there are a couple of standard functions, so you can, if you choose to edit action, you can select change view. You can open a edit page for this element you're working on or something like that. But if you want something more specific, then you have to write it in the code file, which is a JavaScript file in this case. So you have the functionality for that button in this other file. And this is the look and feel of this application. And then we have DataFlex. And here I actually moved the web and mobile and Windows on top of the framework because you don't touch that. Because you write all your code in DataFlex. You don't care about writing HTML or JavaScript or whatever. You could, of course, do that. And you have the model, which is your data dictionaries. So what is going on here? You have the model, which basically is a configuration of all the things you can set as features to the columns in a table. And if you press F7, you have the code, so you can go in and copy and paste if you like, and you can also add your own functions, specific functions in here that are supposed to work for the data. And then you have the view or controller. This is the controller part. And actually, what this controller does is generating a view. So you can see I have a country ID, which generates the ID in the view. I have a web date form, and I have a web grid with 2 columns. And since the code is structured in this way, DataFlex is generating the view automatically. You don't have to write your HTML to generate the view. The view is generated out from the structure of the code. And of course, you can add a button or an event, but you do that inside your view object because you generate objects. And I have, just to get a feel of where the different frameworks, how they relate, I made this graph where you have the coding flexibility. How much can you do with a framework? And you have the development speed. How fast can you get from your initial idea to a full-blown application? And you also can see a little bit the size of the framework, how many features they have. And so PHP, there are a lot of frameworks, and I would say they are around here. And ExtJS depends on how you use it, but generally I would say it ends up here. And my frameworks is a little bit faster in the initial development, but when you want to modify it, you are back to regular speed again. And Microsoft, they have a lot of flexibility, but you will soon run into over-bloating code. And LightSwitch is, you don't have as much flexibility, but you have a good speed. And then DataFlex is up here with both a good balance of flexibility and speed, I think, and they are kind of ahead of the competition. And what I'm arguing is that there's a green line on the graph. And why is there a green line on the graph? It's because the way DataFlex is structured with the objects, the way of creating objects, none of the other development platforms can pass that line and do a better job in creating manageable code. JavaScript is the only option that could do that because they also have objects, structures that you can create that are similar to DataFlex. But the rest of them, you need to separate the controller code from the view code in some way. And if you have classes, now I'm trying to explain a little bit more what I'm talking about here. And you have the classes, which is a blueprint of what you want to work with. And you can create an object like B is block 2x4. So you get a block 2x4. And in conventional way of coding, you start by creating your blocks. And then when you have your blocks, you combine them, you connect them into something beautiful. But in DataFlex, you are creating objects inside of a structure. So if you have a grid, you create a grid column inside of that grid. So you already have the position of the object. And that's why we create a complete set from scratch. And they are see-through because the object has transparency, so they can talk to each other. And if you want to look at code, here's a sample of how you would do it in the other languages. You have a man and you have a car, and in the car you have a seat, because if you don't have a seat, you cannot put a man in the car. And then you create a car, and you create two men, and then you put the man into the seat in the car. In DataFlex, you have a man and you have a car, and you create a car, and then you put two men into the car. And you have everything in one place. You don't have two places where you have to manipulate these things. I actually tried to tweak the PHP to get as close as this functionality as possible. And this is what I came up with. It's actually working pretty well, but the code is really crappy. And it's not nearly usable in production. And what I'm doing is, in order to maintain this order of creating objects, I have to use a class where I store them in an array inside of that class in order to keep the order in which I create them. So I could move this checkbox on top of the name part of the code, and it would change place in the layout. But if I, for some reason, confuse the variable names or reuse the variable names, I'm in a mess. So I cannot get close to the DataFlex way of doing things. So therefore, I'm arguing that developing in DataFlex is about 3 to 5 times faster than any other language you can develop DataFlex code in, or develop applications in. And it's easier to maintain because you have both the control of the layout and the functionality for that specific layout in one place. And you also have a standardized way of writing applications. So if you are building one DataFlex application and then you look at a completely new DataFlex application that you haven't been working with before, you can quite easily figure out how that is working because the way of developing is so standardized. Thank you.